From mysterious rituals in ancient temples to the sacred fires of India and beyond, cannabis has a secret history you've never been told. Understanding this story isn't just about learning the past. It's about uncovering a connection that has shaped humanity for millennia. Stay tuned to discover how this ancient practice continues to influence the world today. The term ancient cannabis cult is not a well-established historical or scholarly term, but it can be interpreted to refer to the early or ancient practices involving the use of cannabis in religious, spiritual, or medicinal contexts. Cannabis, or cannabis sativa, has a long history of use across many ancient cultures, both for its psychoactive properties and its practical uses such as fiber and oil. This video includes an overview of what cannabis is, when and where it originated, and how cannabis was used in various ancient cultures. Cannabis, a plant indigenous to Central Asia, was first domesticated around 8000 BCE. Early records from archaeological sites in China and Mongolia reveal that it was cultivated for its seeds, fiber, and psychoactive properties. By 4000 BCE, cannabis was referenced in Sumerian texts as a plant of joy, a name that hints at its many uses. 1. Ancient India. In ancient India, cannabis has a deep spiritual and ritualistic significance, especially in connection with Hinduism. Cannabis is believed to be a sacred plant, with its use going back thousands of years. It was associated with the god Shiva, who was often depicted as a lover of cannabis. The Atharva Veda called it one of the 5 sacred plants used in rituals to invoke Shiva. Its common uses: bhang, a drink made from ground cannabis leaves mixed with milk, ghee and various spices, has been consumed in India for thousands of years, particularly during religious festivals such as Holi and Mahashivaratri. The consumption of bhang is often linked with spiritual enlightenment or a connection to the divine. Ritualistic use. In Vedic texts, cannabis is referred to as one of the 5 sacred plants and was used in religious rites and ceremonies. Its psychoactive properties were likely seen as a means to reach higher states of consciousness, aiding in meditation and connection with the gods. 2. Ancient China. In ancient China, cannabis was used for both medicinal and practical purposes. The plant's fibers were used for textiles, and its seeds and oils were valued for their nutritional and medicinal properties. In ancient China, Shen Nung's Pharmacopoeia described it as a treatment for gout, malaria, and memory loss. Ancient Chinese texts also mention its psychoactive use, such as Shenong Ben Cao Jing, the oldest pharmacopoeia, dating from around 2700 BCE, mentions cannabis as a medicinal plant with various uses, including for pain relief and other ailments. Shamanistic practices. Cannabis may have been used in certain shamanistic rituals. Though there is less direct evidence of its ritual use, the plant's properties were recognized for their potential in healing and altering consciousness. 3. Scythians and Sarmatians. The ancient Scythians, a nomadic group in Central Asia around 500 BCE, are among the first known cultures to have used cannabis for its psychoactive properties in ceremonial contexts. Herodotus's account. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about the Scythians' use of cannabis. According to him, the Scythians would place cannabis seeds on hot stones to create vapor and then inhale the fumes, a practice that may have been part of their shamanistic or ritualistic activities. Archaeological evidence. Archaeological excavations of Scythian burial sites have uncovered traces of cannabis pollen, suggesting that the plant was used in rituals related to death and the afterlife. Grave goods in Scythian tombs included cannabis, suggesting it played a role in both life and death rituals. 4. Ancient Egypt. There is some evidence that ancient Egyptians used cannabis for medicinal purposes, though direct evidence of ritualistic use is less clear. Cannabis in ancient Egypt is another example of a plant used for practical and medicinal purposes, though there is limited evidence of its religious significance in comparison to some other cultures. Medicinal use. Cannabis was likely used for a range of medicinal purposes in Egypt. Texts like the Ebers Papyrus, circa 1550 BCE, a medical text, mention the use of various plants, and while cannabis is not always specifically named, some scholars suggest that references to remedies for inflammation, pain, and other ailments may have included cannabis. It is believed that cannabis was part of the broader pharmacopoeia that ancient Egyptians used for treating illnesses such as glaucoma, eye problems, and menstrual cramps. Mummification. Some researchers have speculated that cannabis might have been used in the embalming or mummification processes, though evidence is limited and controversial. For example, traces of cannabis and other psychoactive substances have been found in some ancient Egyptian burial sites, leading to speculation about its possible use in funerary rituals. 5. Ancient Greece and Rome. Cannabis entered Greece and Rome via trade routes, where it was used recreationally by the elite. Both the Greeks and Romans were aware of cannabis and its medicinal uses, though its psychoactive properties were not as widely discussed. Hippocrates. The Greek physician Hippocrates is said to have recommended cannabis for various ailments, including inflammation and pain. Galen. The Roman physician Galen also referenced cannabis as a treatment for various conditions, including earaches and inflammation. However, unlike in India or Central Asia, there is little evidence to suggest that cannabis was used widely for religious or mystical purposes in ancient Greece or Rome. 6. Ancient Mesopotamia, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. Cannabis use in ancient Mesopotamia is a subject of some debate, but there is evidence to suggest that the plant was known and possibly used in medicinal contexts by the following Mesopotamia cultures. Sumerians. The Sumerians, one of the earliest known civilizations, were aware of cannabis and other plants with medicinal properties. There are references to cannabis in Sumerian texts, particularly in the context of medicine. The ancient Sumerian pharmacopoeia mentions the use of various herbs, and cannabis may have been one of them. Babylonians and Assyrians. Cannabis appears to have been used by the Babylonians and Assyrians for its medicinal properties. The ancient Assyrian medical texts suggest that cannabis was known for treating ailments like pain and inflammation. Cannabis was sometimes used as part of remedies for conditions such as digestive disorders, pain, and in childbirth. Though there's no definitive evidence that cannabis was used for religious or spiritual purposes in Mesopotamia, it was likely known as a plant with medicinal value and may have been used in religious healing rituals. 7. The role of cannabis in shamanistic and tribal rituals. In many ancient cultures, cannabis may have been used in shamanistic or tribal rituals, where its psychoactive properties were believed to facilitate communication with spirits, enhance vision, and alter consciousness. Psychedelic use. The psychoactive properties of cannabis, especially when burned or vaporized, likely made it an appealing tool for shamans seeking altered states of consciousness, much as other psychoactive plants like psychedelic mushrooms, peyote, or ayahuasca were used in different parts of the world. 8. Ancient Israel, Hebrew Scriptures. There is some evidence to suggest that cannabis may have been used in ancient Israel, particularly in religious and anointing practices, though the direct evidence is limited and often debated. Consider the following. The Kane Bosom controversy. In the Hebrew Bible, specifically the Book of Exodus, there is mention of a plant called cannabosum, which some scholars believe could be cannabis. The term cannabosum appears in the context of the holy anointing oil that was used by priests for sacred rituals. This oil was described as being made from myrrh, cinnamon, and cannabosum, and some have proposed that cannabosum might refer to cannabis, though others suggest it could be another plant like calamus. Ritual use. If cannabis were indeed used in the holy anointing oil, it could indicate that the plant had ritualistic and possibly psychoactive uses within religious ceremonies. However, there is not enough archaeological evidence to definitively link cannabis with these practices, and the interpretation remains speculative. 9. Ancient Persia, Zoroastrianism, and early Islam. In ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, cannabis was widely known and used both for its medicinal properties and for its psychoactive effects, particularly within the context of Zoroastrianism and later Islamic cultures. Let's explore. Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrian texts mention the use of cannabis and other psychoactive plants, though the plant's role in the religious practices of Zoroastrians is not fully understood. Zoroastrians likely used cannabis in medicinal contexts, similar to other ancient cultures. The Hashishin, assassins. The use of cannabis, specifically hashish, became more prominent during the medieval Islamic period, particularly in the case of the Hashishin, assassins, a sect that allegedly used hashish to induce altered states of consciousness as part of their mystical rituals. Although this use occurred somewhat later than the ancient period, it is important to note the continuity of cannabis consumption in Persian culture over the centuries. 10. Ancient Africa, Egypt, Sub-Saharan Africa. Cannabis was known and used across Africa for both practical and spiritual purposes, although its use varied widely by region. Ancient Egypt. As previously mentioned, cannabis may have been used medicinally and potentially in religious practices, though definitive evidence of widespread religious use is not clear. Sub-Saharan Africa. Cannabis was used in various African cultures for both medicinal and spiritual purposes, particularly in healing and divination practices. In some parts of West Africa, cannabis was traditionally used in religious rituals, especially by shamans and spiritual healers who sought to enter altered states of consciousness to communicate with spirits. Rastafarianism. While this is a much more recent development, it's worth noting that the Rastafarian movement, which originated in Jamaica in the 1930s, has its roots in African traditions and strongly incorporates cannabis as a sacrament. Cannabis is seen as a way to gain enlightenment and connect with the divine. 11. Ancient Americas, Native American cultures. Cannabis was not native to the Americas, so indigenous cultures in North and South America did not traditionally use cannabis before European contact. However, following the introduction of the plant to the Americas during the colonial period, it eventually became incorporated into certain spiritual practices. Shamanistic use in the Americas. Indigenous peoples in North and South America had a long history of using other psychoactive plants, like peyote, ayahuasca, and tobacco, in religious and shamanistic rituals. While cannabis was not originally part of these traditions, it eventually became a part of some indigenous and syncretic religious practices in the 19th and 20th centuries. 12. Ancient Southeast Asia. Cannabis was also known in ancient Southeast Asia, particularly in countries like Thailand, Vietnam, and previously mentioned China and India. China. As mentioned, cannabis was used medicinally, and its fibers were used for making textiles, ropes, and other materials. Some texts from ancient China, including those from the Han Dynasty around 2nd century BCE, describe the use of cannabis for medicinal purposes. the psychoactive properties were likely recognized, though the focus was primarily on medicinal and practical uses. Thailand and Southeast Asia. Cannabis was introduced to Southeast Asia from Central Asia and China thousands of years ago. By the early medieval period, cannabis had spread through the region, and in many areas, it was used in both medicine and recreational contexts. To summarize, cannabis as a sacred plant. In many ancient cultures, cannabis was not only valued for its practical uses, e.g., fiber and oil, but also held spiritual significance. Ritual and spiritual use. Cannabis was associated with various deities, most notably Shiva in Hinduism, and was used in rituals to facilitate spiritual experiences, healing, or divination. Medicinal use. Across cultures, cannabis was used for its medicinal properties, such as pain relief, treating digestive problems, and as an anti-inflammatory. Psychoactive use. In cultures like the Scythians, cannabis was used for its psychoactive effects, often in ceremonial or shamanistic contexts. While there is no singular unified ancient cannabis cult in historical records, the plant's role in ancient civilizations was multifaceted, spanning religious, medicinal, and practical uses across the world. The belief in its power to connect with the divine or alter consciousness was likely a part of many ancient religious and shamanistic practices. Cannabis was used across many ancient civilizations and cultures, often for a variety of purposes, including medicinal, practical, such as for textiles, and spiritual uses. In some cultures, like in ancient India and Central Asia, cannabis played a significant role in religious and shamanistic practices. In others, like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, its use appears to have been primarily medicinal, with limited evidence of its use for spiritual or psychoactive purposes. While we cannot speak of a singular ancient cannabis cult, it is clear that cannabis was a widely known and used plant across many parts of the ancient world, with its significance and uses varying by culture and region. The surprising ancient cannabis cult isn't just history, it's a living legacy. Understanding this story gives us insight into humanity's enduring relationship with nature's most fascinating plant.